Hi, this is Logan Preshaw, an Australian-based concept artist and illustrator. Thanks for tuning in to part 2 of this tutorial series of me painting Tails from the Sonic franchise. In this second part of the tutorials, I'll be dropping quite a number of thoughts around things such as process, digital art and the tools around digital art, and it's just some thoughts around design and some of the design decisions I made around my own version of Tails and why I decided to create these artworks in the first place. If you've just started watching on this part 2 and you're wondering why it looks like I'm starting the painting from scratch, I encourage you to go back and watch part 1. It was a mistaken attempt which I wound up throwing out, and in that part I talk a little bit about the mistakes that we make as artists, the fact that all artists make mistakes, including experienced professionals, and also how to learn from our mistakes, and then a few other thoughts that I think are probably worth going back and watching if you haven't seen them yet. So just a few little details and things to be aware of are that this video sped up about 8 times from real time, so no, believe it or not, I'm not that fast. And there's some cutouts in the video to save time. So unessential things such as me filling in just the flat color pass is cut out. It's very simple. It's ultimately me just lassoing around the inside of the contours of the drawing and filling that in. I've cut those parts out just to save the time on the video a little bit so it doesn't stretch out forever. And I've removed parts of the video where I either got up for a break or I stopped recording or whatever, so the clock on the bottom right isn't going to be very reliable. So I'll start off with a little bit of backstory around why I decided to create my own takes on Sonic and Tails from the Sonic franchise. The movie trailer had recently just come out, and I saw it as a good opportunity to create some artworks around one of my favorite franchises, and I really love the Sonic characters. Ultimately, I wanted to do my own takes, so this wasn't an attempt to be a solution for the film or one of those things where it's like, hey, you guys should do it this way. I believe that the people working on those films are doing the best that they can, and I don't want to step all over their toes. I just really wanted to create my own version of Sonic and Tails, and it seemed like a lot of the attention around what was happening would be the perfect opportunity for people to see it, and ultimately I just wanted to inject them with the aesthetics that I personally enjoy and my own style. One of the big goals for me personally around creating this design was to accentuate some of Tails' personality and his occupation, and also to help explain his abilities. So in the games he flies by sort of rotating his two tails as like a helicopter rotor, and I tried to imbue that with a little bit more realism by giving him some jetpacks or like jet type maneuvering abilities to kind of explain that if it was in a more realistic context, it would be a little bit more believable as to why he's flying around. And I tried to add some engineering type gear on top of his design to sell his occupation a little bit more, because he's kind of like the tech head of the group. Inevitably, he's going to be building all sorts of contraptions and inventions and probably using them himself. So I thought it'd be a really cool chance to kind of add to his design and bring in some interesting little greebles and techie details that would help elevate his design beyond where it already was, which was, without insulting Sega's beautiful original design, ultimately just a yellow fox. A great advantage to adding a few more details to his design was being able to enhance the aesthetics and silhouette of his character, so there were a few opportunities to break out his silhouette and create forms that would help him be a little bit more recognizable than he already is, and also just to add some interesting techie aesthetics to his soft, kind of friendly fox forms. So I should emphasize again that, yeah, this was my own personal take. I wasn't trying to do anything in particular with design. I wasn't trying to get him to movie quality or suggest to Paramount or anybody like that that they should use this design in the film or anything. This was ultimately just a chance for me to do some fan art around one of my favorite characters, and the Sonic was exactly the same. I think a good attitude to have around creating fan art or personal work in general is to push what you really want to see out there, or artwork that you would be a fan of yourself. In my experience, one of the greatest motivations for creating artwork in general is a need or desire to create work that you haven't seen out there yet, or just to enjoy the process of creating work. I think that it's kind of like a duality, so the end result you hope is something that you enjoy, and inevitably what you enjoy will perhaps be something that you haven't seen or something that somebody else hasn't done. Even if it's not, I think it's a fairly good goal to shoot for, to create work that is a combination of either all your favorite artists or it's just something that you've always wanted to see out there but you've never really seen before. And in that sense, shoot towards becoming your own favorite artist for the most part. Inevitably, if you're a combination of all the things that you really enjoy, you may be moving towards that goal already. So I'll delve in a little bit more about my process. I know that some people are probably looking for a real-time step-by-step or, how to paint or something like that. That's definitely not what this is, but it's hopefully going to be a good indication of my linear working method and my thoughts around when I'm painting. I think a time lapse format for this kind of stuff is really a great way to do it, mainly because the individual strokes don't really matter. Especially with a commentary, it's like you get to see the progress of how I create the artwork, and then you also get to hear my thoughts around the reasons behind it and everything. And I think that kind of stuff is probably more helpful to people in the end than like a step by step, this is how you do this kind of thing. Because a lot of that just comes with time. So much of artwork just comes through experience and just doing it. And I think I would be doing people more favors if I shared my thoughts and some important stuff around mindset and experiences than, hand holding them through the creation of artwork. Because ultimately, as much as I wish I could teach people to draw really well in a very short amount of time, it's just time and effort. That being said, there's still probably quite a bit around my process that I think people could learn from, since, like I mentioned before, it's worth looking at artists that you enjoy and trying to dissect how they work and, involving the stuff that you like and you think works for you and leaving the stuff that doesn't. So my process is mainly influenced by just lots of painting, just doing a lot of painting, and what I like in masters' techniques and their mindsets. So I've looked at a lot of Gumroad tutorials and video tutorials and read a lot of books around painting and artwork and design and things like that. And ultimately, the lessons that I agreed with and the things that I enjoy are what made their way into my artwork. And a lot of that has been filtered through just experience and time. So it's like eventually you find things that don't work for you and you drop them, and then things that do work. I think the most important aspect of having your own method and finding your own technique is that it keeps art fresh for you, and it extends the way that your brain works. So I come from more of a line art background, and I'm used to drawing out forms in line rather than strictly in paint or anything like that. I like tackling paint later on and painting over the line work, and it's just the way that I work, and I've found that I'm comfortable with working. My brain is able to wrap its head around, my brain is able to comprehend forms a lot better when it's drawn out in line, and then I paint over that. Sometimes I'll go straight into paint, but ultimately this is just the way that I found best works for me, and it's going to be different for everybody else. So I could go through and describe my process in every little detail, but it's a very personal thing for every artist. I'm just going to try and describe the things that I think are the most important to me, and a lot of that just comes down to things like what influences your style and your approach, and observation of the world around you. It's like having steps and technique available is really great, but that makes up like 10% of painting. The majority of it is what you think and how you feel and who you are when you're painting. That all being said, I personally think the most important aspect of any painting is the non-personal aspects of fundamentals such as color, composition, design, value, and things like that. Things that are consistent through pretty much any artwork and that can be learned by anybody. You just have to go out and learn them. Read books, watch tutorials. They're well beyond the scope of a 20-minute time lapse, but hopefully I can impress on people the importance of learning them. I hope to create more tutorials around those kinds of things in the future, but I think that a time lapse such as this is better suited to explaining personal process and thought around an artwork rather than diving deep into things such as the fundamentals around it. I think that really needs to be shown through diagrams or focused studies. And that stuff is really solidified. Shit, that stuff is really solidified in a beginner through just sheer experience and method. So I hope ultimately what you take away from this is that my approach doesn't have all the answers. I hope it has some answers for you, and maybe you'll see something that I do in this time lapse that you like, and you're like, oh man, that's an interesting way of doing that. Maybe I'll take that and do that myself. But ultimately, it doesn't have all the answers, and you need to find your own method of working. If it's very close to the way that I work and you really enjoy that, awesome. But I know that there are plenty of people who work in a very, very different manner to myself. I think you just got to look for what you like and pick out what works for you. And I think the majority of what holds together a good artist and a good technique and approach in general is solid foundations and just accumulated experience. So go out and paint, go out and observe, read books, continue challenging yourself and putting yourself in situations where you will learn. One thing I will touch on in terms of my process is the value of a linear working method. So the way that I work with characters, starting off with line work and then creating the flat color and then painting over that, is it tends to break down the process into individual, easy to manage parts. So when you're doing the line work, all you're really focusing on is the design and the silhouette and the form and the mass of the character. You're not worrying about color, you're not worrying about texture or anything like that. You're just focusing on those aspects of the character and the illustration. And then when you start laying in the flat colors, all you're worried about is those flat colors and how they relate to the design. And then when you start painting over that, you can paint with the knowledge that everything else is worked properly and that it's solid, and that you can paint into it without worrying too much about any mistakes around the drawing cropping up, or about your colors not being consistent, because you've already worked that all out. It just helps to break down the process and make it more manageable, make it a little bit less stressful as you work through each individual part of it. This also has the advantage of highlighting any lapses in your foundations, or when the artwork goes wrong. So if you save the artwork out in versions, or you keep track of where you are in the artwork and something happens and you're like, oh, that doesn't look right, you can usually track down where it went wrong, whether it was in the drawing stage or the flat color stage or the shading. If you're learning, I find that that's very useful for tracking down any weaknesses in your foundations, things that you might need to improve on. If you're tackling everything at once, it can be hard to track down exactly where you went wrong with the artwork. I think that painting without a structured technique or method is actually a really good exercise to engage in. It can teach you a few other things rather than what you would usually be exposed to when you're doing like a linear process. So painting a whole scene or a whole character just by jumping in and mucking around, that can be a really good learning experience as well. And sometimes you need that mucking around time. I think that having some time to allow yourself to make mistakes or to jump into something without it being fully structured or thought through can be really, really valuable in terms of teaching you how to think on your feet, and just have fun as well. It's just a really fun activity to engage in. This type of exercise lends itself very well to learning the tools within software as well. So we have a lot of digital tools and functionalities built into the software that you use to create artwork. And there's some unconventional ways of doing things that are actually very, very useful to artists. So I tend to use a lot of custom shapes, transformations, blending modes, adjustment layers, and stuff like that to help enhance my artwork. And I learned a lot of those little digital tricks via the aforementioned just painting without structure. So yeah, there's a few benefits to going with a completely unstructured approach. Try both out. I think there are some artists out there who have made an unstructured, painterly, chaotic approach work for them. And there are others who simply cannot work in that manner, but it's just one of those things where it's like, this is what I mean by experimenting and going out and doing stuff, and that I can't impress everything about painting on you, especially in this short period of time, as much as I'd like to. It's so much of it is just going out and doing it yourself. Having some personal guidance by an artist can be very useful, but ultimately, I find that the most important learning around paintings happens through just self-introspection and really just private painting time. So I've had a lot of beginners ask me about my brushes, the brushes that I use, and how do I get this texture and all this kind of stuff. And it's one of those things that experienced artists kind of have a little giggle about because it really doesn't matter. It's one of those things where beginners have this impression that brushes are what make an artist. I mean, maybe it's not that drastic, but they sort of give the indication that it is, and it really doesn't. Beyond things like texture and automation, it's not about the brushes. It's 100% about how you use them. I know that there are certain brushes that I use that speed up some tasks for me. Creating certain textures with, say, a basic round brush would just be a complete pain in the ass, as opposed to having a purpose-made brush for that kind of thing. But ultimately, I only use about like 5 or 6 brushes the majority of the time. I know that my brush pack has, like, you can see it pop up. It has quite a few. Those are all from other artists. Like, I think I made like 1 or 2 brushes that are my own that I've built from scratch, and they're really not that impressive. It's like the hard round with color variation on the stroke, and that's pretty much as adventurous as I get. But the main point is that I only really use very few of those brushes in the set for the majority of my painting. The rest are there for very incidental things, such as if I have a mountain in the background and I desperately don't need to paint that texture, I just don't have the time for it, then I'll have a brush in there to lay down some rocks really quickly. But for the most part, I have a number of brushes that I'm very comfortable with and that I use all the time. And I think that's probably the best way to treat them, just as convenience measures. Every digital software is going to have a different brush engine and a different working method. So if your technique is purely dependent on your brushes and you move from Photoshop to, say, Procreate, you're going to be stuffed. And I can say the brushes don't really change much. I wouldn't boil my painting technique and skill down to the brushes that I use. Okay, so that's all the thoughts that I can leave on this video. I've pretty much run out of notes at this point. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the tutorial. Subscribe if you want to follow my future tutorial material. Leave a comment if you have any questions, or if you want to poke my brain about the process that I use, my approach to painting, my work, anything like that. Feel free to chat about it. And please check out my Artstation and Gumroad stores if you're interested in further, more in-depth tutorial material. Thanks very much for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the rest of the time lapse. It runs considerably longer than the first one, mainly because I wanted to slow it down and let people see a little bit more of the process. So yeah, enjoy, and I'll hopefully see you again in the future.